Hello, welcome to the Scouts BSA breakout for this month's Pomperaug District Roundtable. My name is Jeff Glans. I'm the Scoutmaster for Troop 34 in Bridgeport. And at our last roundtable, we were talking about advancement and how different troops handled training and following advancement. And I mentioned that our troop several years ago had developed a training program for scouts, and several people mentioned that they would like to maybe see a presentation on that. So I kind of put together something relatively quickly. So a couple years ago, Dave Mestry and I realized that our older scouts were not doing a particularly good job in their training, and the information was not being effectively transferred. And so we decided that we would develop a program in which we could train scouts to become instructors, and as kind of a little bonus for them, they would receive an instructor badge at the outcome of them successfully completing the course, and they would be the only scouts that were allowed to train other scouts. We really want to emphasize the EDGE method, and we felt like that would be a really good basis to work from. And the other thing that we wanted to work from was the Train the Trainer program that had already been adopted for adult leader training. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the EDGE method, but just to remind everyone, it's an acronym for explain, demonstrate, guide, and enable, the four stages of transferring a skill from one scout to another. We decided that the simplest way to do this was to set it up as 3 sessions. We had originally anticipated that these would be hour-long sessions. They ended up going closer to about an hour and a half each. This was also kind of as the pandemic was winding down, and so everyone was very used to dealing with Zoom. So we ran these as Zoom, which worked pretty effectively. We had to work around a couple of issues. It's difficult to demonstrate first aid on someone over Zoom, so we worked on ways to deal with that. But there's certainly no reason that this couldn't be done in person, or even as a single session in person, much like the introduction to youth leadership training. So the 3 sessions are split out, shown here. Obviously, in the first session, we wanted to introduce the scouts to the concept of what we've been doing, remind them what the EDGE method was. Dave spent some time working with Train the Trainer presentation that already existed, modified it a little bit to be more applicable for scouts. And so he worked through that. And then the last thing was we assigned them some homework. And the homework consisted of preparing a presentation that would be to other scouts to demonstrate a skill. So let's work through these sessions one by one. The first session ended with a discussion of the homework, and they were required to use the EDGE method to do this. It was understood that they would probably have to have a subject to work on. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And the first assignment was we picked something pretty simple that they wasn't something they were going to have to go refresh their memory on how to do, something simple like teaching a square knot. And one of the things that we wanted to have them think about were the difficulties in or differences in presenting a physical skill like tying a knot, or knowledge like, what does the, explain the scout oath. And we largely stuck with physical things during this training, but you could obviously do either. So at the beginning of the second session, each of the scouts then presented their skill to another scout, and we did it via Zoom. But the second scout would have to demonstrate that. And it might be required that if that was something that was like a first aid thing, like demonstrate how to immobilize a shoulder, they would need a second person to do that. So we often recruited siblings or parents to enable them to do that demonstration. We also encourage the scout that was on the recipient of the training to act as if they didn't already know the skill, but to cooperate and basically not make it more difficult than is necessary, but to try and act like a normal scout trying to learn a skill was. And then we had a little bit of time in which the performance was critiqued, primarily by the other scouts, and in fact, primarily by the scout that was learning the technique. How well did they feel like they learned it, and how well did the presentation go? And then if there was anything that we thought that was missed, the instructors would chime in. Then we moved on to Dave's second train the trainer unit. And then lastly, we had a second set of homework, which was a second skill to present. And we had already encouraged the scouts to think about the skill that they would like to present. In this one, we did ask that it was a little more complex than something like a square knot, something like teaching a lashing or one of the more complex first aid requirements or whatever. And so they went away from the end of that session and prepared for the third session, in which we repeated exactly the same process. They presented that skill to one of the other scouts that was involved in the class. Again, very often this required a subject to work upon, especially if it was a first aid requirement. And then there was self-critique and critique by the other scouts, and if we thought they missed anything. And at this point, the instructors really didn't have to do very much. The scouts pretty much caught everything. And then Dave wrapped up the third unit of Train the Trainer, which is largely a wrap up the whole process. And then we went back and asked the scouts to critique the entire process, how well they thought it prepared them to be able to do training. So at this point, the scout was considered an instructor and was allowed to sign off on requirements. But we didn't really let it go at that point. As instructors, we kept an eye on what was going on and reinforced those skills, because it's easy to, in the heat of a troop meeting or a camp out or something, to forget to use the edge method, or to just, simply show somebody how to do this something and kind of walk away. So we have found that it's a good idea to reinforce these skills. And it's also a good idea to encourage the scouts to reinforce these skills, because they're, a little reinforcement from a peer is probably more effective than reinforcement from one of the adult leaders. As I mentioned, we had originally thought that these would go an hour, about an hour. They ended up going closer to an hour and a half to give the scouts time to do their presentations. We did it as once a week in the evening, so that they would have time to do the work in between. But, scouts will be scouts. They were probably doing their preparation 10 minutes before the session anyway. So timing probably isn't that important. And, if you had sufficient time for them to do a little preparation, you could do this as a morning or an afternoon run, basically run them all the way through. We did encourage the scouts to make sure that they had their own materials, especially for things like first aid. We always encourage them to have a first aid kit anyway. And so it was good if they were pulling material from their own first aid kits. As a practical matter, I know that some of the troops require instructors to be Star or even Life. We're a very small troop, and we just simply don't have that many older, more advanced scouts to do that. So basically, first class was where we would kind of set the bar, where we would consider someone eligible to take this training so that they can become an instructor. That's pretty much all I wanted to present tonight. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them via email, or let's get together and chat at the March Roundtable, which will most likely be in person.